The autumn wind whistled through the empty playground as I watched Tommy Harris slouch deeper into his oversized hoodie, his shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. Something had changed in him over the past few weeks, the spark in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a wariness that no 12-year-old should carry. As his teacher, I'd seen plenty of kids go through rough patches, but this was different. This was fear. "Mrs. Reynolds." Tommy's voice barely carried across the few feet between us. "Can I stay in during recess again tomorrow?" I studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way he wouldn't quite meet my gaze. "Tommy, this is the third time this week. Is everything okay at home?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and I saw his fingers tighten around the straps of his backpack until his knuckles went white. "Everything's fine," he mumbled, but the tremor in his voice told a different story. That evening, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. My husband Mike found me at the kitchen table, staring at Tommy's latest writing assignment, a creative story that was supposed to be about a happy memory but instead described a world where shadows came alive and swallowed people whole. "Still worried about that Harris kid?" Mike set a cup of coffee in front of me, his wedding ring clinking against the ceramic. He was still in his detective suit, his tie loosened after a long day at the precinct. "Something's wrong, Mike. I can feel it." I pushed the paper toward him. "Read this. Tell me this doesn't set off every alarm bell you've got." Mike skimmed the paper, his brow furrowing. "Becky, honey, I know you care about your students, but you need to be careful. Getting too involved in people's personal lives can be dangerous, especially in this town." I knew what he meant. Our small community of Millbrook had its share of secrets, and some of them had sharp edges. But I couldn't let it go. Not after what I'd seen earlier that day. During lunch period, I'd noticed Tommy's father, James Harris, parked across the street from the school. He sat in his expensive black SUV, tinted windows rolled down just enough for me to catch the gleam of his eyes as he watched the playground. Something about the way he stared made my skin crawl. I'd heard rumors about his business dealings, whispers about shipments that arrived in the dead of night at his warehouse on the edge of town. I did some digging, I admitted to Mike, watching his expression shift from concern to alarm. Harris Import-Export isn't just bringing in furniture from overseas. The numbers don't add up. And yesterday, I saw Tommy trying to hide bruises during gym class. Mike set down his coffee cup with enough force to slosh liquid onto the table. "Becky, stop. Right now. James Harris is not someone you want to mess with. The department's been trying to build a case against him for years, but witnesses have a funny way of disappearing. So we just let him hurt his son." My voice rose with indignation. "I became a teacher to protect kids, Mike, not to look the other way when they're suffering. And I became a cop to protect people like you from people like him," Mike shot back, running a hand through his graying hair. "Please, just this once, let the system handle it." But I couldn't. Not when I saw the same haunted look in Tommy's eyes that I'd carried at his age, when my own father's demons had turned our home into a battlefield. I'd survived because one teacher had cared enough to notice, to fight for me. Now it was my turn to be that person for someone else. Later that night, I sat in my home office, compiling everything I'd observed about Tommy's behavior changes over the past month. The sudden drop in grades, the withdrawal from friends, the flinching at loud noises. I didn't realize how late it had gotten until my computer screen reflected movement behind me. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the notification on my phone, an email from an anonymous address. The subject line read, "Mind your own business, Mrs. Reynolds." Attached was a photo taken earlier that day, me, standing in my front yard, watering the flowers. The message was clear, I was being watched. Mike was right about one thing, this was dangerous. But as I sat there, staring at the threatening email, I thought about Tommy, alone in whatever hell his father had created. The system hadn't protected me when I was a kid. Sometimes, the system needed a push. I opened my drawer and pulled out the burner phone I'd bought last week, my fingers hovering over the keypad. I had a contact at the local newspaper, someone who might be interested in the financial irregularities I'd discovered at Harris Import-Export. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As I typed out the message, a car drove past our house, slower than normal, its headlights sweeping across my window like searchlights. I held my breath until it passed, but the fear had already crystallized into something harder, something that felt like resolve. Tomorrow, I would talk to Tommy again. And this time, I wouldn't back down until I got the truth. Even if it meant stepping into the shadows myself. The morning dawned with the kind of clarity that only comes after a sleepless night, every shadow sharp-edged and significant. I watched the sunrise paint my classroom in shades of amber, knowing that today would change everything. The anonymous email still burned in my mind, its threat carrying the acrid taste of copper and fear. I arrived early, parking my car in my usual spot, but nothing felt usual anymore. Each face in the steadily filling parking lot became a potential observer, every casual glance loaded with possible meaning. The weight of surveillance pressed against my skin like a cold hand. Tommy was already waiting outside my classroom when I arrived, his small frame nearly disappearing beneath his backpack. But it wasn't his usual before-school visit seeking sanctuary. His face bore the unmistakable evidence of what I'd feared, a bruise blooming across his left cheekbone like a terrible flower. "I fell," he said before I could speak, the lie rehearsed and hollow. "I'm really clumsy sometimes." The words hit me like physical blows, echoes of my own childhood excuses. I'd told my teachers I was clumsy too, crafted elaborate stories about bicycle accidents and falls from trees. None of them had looked past the lies, except Mrs. Harrison in 6th grade. She'd been my salvation, the one adult who'd seen through the carefully constructed facade of normalcy. "Come inside, Tommy," I said softly, unlocking the door with hands that wanted to shake but couldn't afford to. "Let's talk." We sat in the gentle morning light, the empty classroom our confession booth. I didn't push, didn't demand. Instead, I told him about a little girl who used to hide her bruises, who learned to move silently through her own house like a ghost, who believed she deserved the pain until someone showed her she didn't. "That girl was you," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. His eyes met mine for the first time in weeks, recognition flickering in their depths. "Yes," I answered, the admission both victory and wound. "And she survived. She grew up. She became strong. The bell would ring in 20 minutes. 20 minutes to bridge the chasm between silence and truth." I watched Tommy's hands clench and unclench in his lap, his internal battle visible in every tense line of his body. "If I tell..." He started, then stopped, swallowing hard. He said he'd hurt Mom if I ever told. "She's sick. She needs her medicine, and he's the only one who can afford it." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. James Harris wasn't just using his import business as a cover, he was using his wife's illness as a weapon against his own son. The elegance of the trap made me want to scream. "Tommy, I can help. There are people, organizations dash." The sound of a car door slamming outside cut through my words. Tommy's face went white. Through the classroom window, I saw James Harris striding across the parking lot, his expensive suit out of place against the modest backdrop of Millbrook Elementary. "He's not supposed to be here," Tommy whispered, panic threading through his voice. "Not today. Today's not his day." I made a decision that would set everything in motion. "Tommy, go to the library. Now. Use the back door." He didn't hesitate, disappearing just as heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. I pulled out my phone, opening the video recording app with trembling fingers as James Harris burst into my classroom. The next 3 minutes changed everything. His rage at finding Tommy gone transformed him, stripping away the veneer of successful businessman to reveal something monstrous beneath. He threatened me, threatened Tommy, threatened to destroy everything I loved if I didn't mind my own fucking business. Every word, every threat, captured perfectly on my phone. When he finally left, hurricane of violence and promises of retribution, I sat at my desk and made 2 calls. The first to the police, reporting what I'd witnessed and seen. The second to Mike, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "It's done," I told him. "I've crossed the Rubicon." His silence spoke volumes before he finally responded, "I'll increase patrols in our neighborhood. But Becky, he'll come after you now. Men like Harris don't take kindly to witnesses." "Let him come," I replied, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. I'm not that frightened little girl anymore. But watching Tommy return to class, his shoulders hunched and eyes downcast, I knew the real battle was just beginning. The police would need his testimony, his confirmation of the abuse. And James Harris had already demonstrated how effectively he could silence his son. That afternoon, I found a note in my mailbox at school. Inside was a small bag of white powder and 3 words, "You're carrying this." The implication was clear: Harris could destroy my career, my freedom, my life with a single anonymous tip. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt an odd sense of calm settle over me. He'd shown his hand, revealed the depths he would sink to. Now I knew exactly what kind of monster I was dealing with. As I drove home that evening, a black SUV followed me for 3 blocks before peeling away. A warning, a reminder that I was being watched. But they weren't the only ones who could watch, who could gather evidence, who could play the long game. I pulled into my driveway, walked calmly to my front door, and began to plan. If James Harris wanted to play with shadows, he'd soon learn I had plenty of darkness of my own. That night, our bedroom became a battlefield of unspoken fears and barely contained rage. Mike paced the floor, his detective's composure cracking with each turn, while I sat on the edge of our bed, turning the burner phone over and over in my hands. The weight of it felt like a grenade with its pin half pulled. "You don't understand what Harris is capable of." Mike's voice carried the weight of countless case files I'd never seen, horrors he'd never shared. The last person who tried to expose him, Christ, Becky, they never even found enough pieces to hold a proper funeral. The words should have terrified me. Instead, they crystallized something in my chest, a diamond-hard certainty born from the ashes of my own childhood trauma. And what about what I'm capable of, Mike? Everyone looks at me and sees the sweet elementary school teacher who brings homemade cookies to PTA meetings. Nobody sees the girl who survived her father's rage by learning to be smarter, more patient, more calculating than her abuser. My words hung in the air between us like smoke signals, warning signs of a fire Mike hadn't known was burning. He stopped pacing, really looking at me for perhaps the first time since this began. I watched understanding dawn in his eyes, the realization that his wife wasn't just charging blindly into danger, but navigating it with the expertise of someone who'd spent a lifetime mapping the topography of violence. "Tell me your plan," he said finally, sinking into the chair by the window. "Tell me how we survive this." The "we" caught in my throat like a fish hook. I'd been so focused on Tommy, on Harris, on my own demons, I'd almost forgotten that my choices were drawing Mike into the crosshairs too. The guilt of it mixed with gratitude, creating an emotion I had no name for. "I've been documenting everything," I began, pulling out the encrypted USB drive I'd kept hidden in my jewelry box. "Every bruise on Tommy, every threatening email, every suspicious car that's followed me. But more importantly, I've been tracking Harris's business patterns. The shipments that arrive at odd hours, the discrepancies in his import manifests, the shell companies that seem to exist only on paper." Mike's professional interest sparked despite his concern. "How did you get access to his business records? Remember Jenny Martinez from the county clerk's office? Her daughter was in my class 3 years ago. I helped her through her divorce, gave her a shoulder to cry on when she thought her world was ending. Now she helps me access public records without leaving a digital trail." I smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. You taught me that, Mike. The importance of building relationships, of having people who owe you favors. The revelation seemed to unsettle him, this evidence that his sweet, caring wife had been playing a longer game than anyone suspected. But I wasn't finished. The newspaper contact. She's waiting for my signal. One email and Harris's financial irregularities become front-page news. But that's just the beginning. I've identified 3 of his warehouse workers who might talk if given the right incentive. One of them has a daughter in my class, a daughter who desperately needs help with her reading, who stays late every Tuesday and Thursday for extra tutoring while her father works overtime at the warehouse. Jesus, Becky. Mike ran a hand over his face. You've been building an intelligence network using PTA meetings and parent-teacher conferences. I learned from the best. The compliment carried an edge of accusation. How many nights had I listened to him talk about building cases, about the importance of documentation and leverage? While he'd been teaching me to protect myself, I'd been learning how to wage war. But the war had casualties I hadn't anticipated. That evening, Tommy wasn't in class. When I called the office, I discovered he'd been transferred to another school district, one conveniently outside my reach. The message was clear: Harris was isolating his son, cutting off my access. What he didn't know was that I'd prepared for this. Tommy's new school had a guidance counselor who'd been my roommate in college. Another thread in the web I'd been weaving, another ally position before she was needed. That night, as Mike and I lay in bed, neither sleeping, both lost in our own thoughts, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. A video attachment, me, earlier that day, making copies in my classroom. The angle suggested it was shot through the window. Beneath it, words that were meant to terrify: teachers die in accidents all the time. I showed it to Mike, watched his face darken with rage and fear. But beneath those emotions, I caught a glimpse of something else: recognition. He was finally seeing me clearly, understanding that the woman he'd married wasn't just surviving this nightmare, she was methodically dismantling it, piece by piece. "I can't talk you out of this, can I?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "No," I replied, my certainty as solid as bedrock. "But you can help me do it right." As the night deepened around us, we began to plan in earnest. 2 professionals, each skilled in our own forms of warfare, combining our knowledge to save a child neither of us had planned to love. And somewhere in the darkness, I felt my younger self, that terrified girl who'd survived her father's abuse, finally begin to heal. The accusations against Mike landed like precision strikes, each one calculated to devastate our foundations. I stood in our kitchen, watching dawn crawl across the granite countertops while the local news droned in the background: Detective Michael Reynolds suspended pending investigation into evidence tampering and theft. The words seemed to hang in the air like toxic smoke, choking every breath with their implications. The evidence Harris had fabricated was beautiful in its sophistication, a masterwork of destruction. Security footage showing Mike entering the evidence locker at odd hours, financial records suggesting deposits that matched missing drug money, even witness statements claiming they'd seen him meeting with known criminals. Each piece clicked into place with the terrible precision of a well-oiled trap. I traced my fingers across our wedding photo on the wall, remembering the man who'd sworn to protect and serve, now branded a corrupt cop by the very system he'd dedicated his life to defending. The irony carved new wounds into my already scarred heart. Harris hadn't just attacked Mike, he'd violated the core of who my husband was, poisoned the very purpose that defined him. "They're calling it a routine investigation," Mike said from behind me, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of service now tainted by suspicion. "But we both know what this is. Harris is sending us a message. This is what happens when we try to protect someone he considers his property." I turned to face my husband, really seeing him in the harsh morning light. The proud detective was gone, replaced by a man aged decades in days, his shoulders bearing the burden of false shame. But beneath the defeat in his eyes, I caught a glimmer of something else, a dangerous understanding of what comes next. He thinks he's broken us, I said, my voice carrying an edge that surprised us both. He thinks that by destroying your reputation, he's neutralized the threat. That's his mistake. He doesn't understand that he's just freed us from the constraints of working within the system. Mike's eyes met mine, recognition flickering between us like static electricity. Becky, what are you saying? I'm saying that men like Harris succeed because they expect everyone to play by the rules while they operate outside them. They count on good people being predictable, being moral, being afraid. My hand steadied as I spoke, each word carrying the weight of certainty. But he's forgotten something crucial about people who've survived abuse. We learned our abusers' playbooks by heart. We had to survive. I pulled out my laptop, opening files I'd been compiling for weeks. While he was focused on destroying your career, I've been building a network. Remember Maria from the cleaning service at his warehouse? Her son just got accepted to college on a full scholarship, arranged through an educational foundation that, coincidentally, I helped establish last year. She's been documenting every suspicious shipment, every late-night meeting, every envelope of cash that changes hands. Mike's expression shifted from despair to a complex mixture of pride and fear. You've been running your own investigation. I learned from watching you. But unlike you, I'm not bound by warrant requirements or probable cause. Harris thinks he's dealing with a schoolteacher playing at detective. He doesn't realize he's facing someone who learned strategy from surviving a war zone disguised as a home. The sound of car doors slamming outside interrupted us. Through our kitchen window, I watched two internal affairs officers approach our front door. Mike's hands clenched into fists, but I caught his arm before he could move. Let them come, I whispered, my voice carrying a conviction that surprised even me. Every accusation they make, every piece of evidence they present, it's all part of Harris's paper trail. And paper trails can be followed back to their source. As the doorbell rang, I squeezed Mike's hand one last time. You taught me that the best defense is a good offense. Now it's time to show Harris what happens when he pushes two people who have nothing left to lose. The officers entered our home with warranted confidence, their badges gleaming with authority. They didn't notice the hidden camera I'd installed weeks ago, recording every word, every accusation, every piece of their unwitting participation in Harris's scheme. They couldn't see that their very presence was another thread in the web I was weaving, a web that would eventually entangle everyone involved in this conspiracy of silence and violence. As they led Mike away for questioning, I caught his eye one last time. In that moment, we shared an understanding deeper than words. This wasn't just about saving Tommy anymore. This was about exposing the rot that allowed men like Harris to thrive, about dismantling the systems that protected predators while punishing those who dared to stand against them. I watched the police car disappear around the corner, carrying my husband toward an uncertain fate. But uncertainty had been my constant companion since childhood. I'd learned to navigate its treacherous waters, to find strength in its chaos. Harris thought he'd severed our strongest connection, isolated me from my most powerful ally. Instead, he'd just removed the last of my hesitation. As I closed our front door, I pulled out the burner phone and typed a simple message to my newspaper contact, "It's time." The response came almost immediately, "The story runs tomorrow." The game was changing. Harris had played his hand, thinking he held all the cards. He didn't realize I'd been playing a different game entirely, one where the rules were written in the language of survival, in the grammar of revenge served not hot with passion, but cold with calculated precision. The newspaper story detonated like a precision bomb in our small town, its shockwaves rippling through every carefully maintained facade of respectability. I sat in my empty classroom as dawn painted the walls with accusation, reading the headlines that would reshape our battlefield: local business empire built on corruption, prominent importer linked to drug trade, money laundering. Each paragraph was a blade, honed by months of meticulous documentation, wielded with surgical precision. The financial records I'd gathered through my network of seemingly innocuous connections, parents, teachers, administrative staff, now formed a noose of evidence around Harris's empire. But the true poison lay in the human interest angle, whispered testimonies of domestic violence, of a wife kept compliant through carefully controlled medical care, of a son whose silence was purchased with his mother's survival. The story hadn't just exposed Harris's criminal enterprise, it had stripped away his carefully cultivated image of the successful businessman, the community leader, the devoted family man. In its place stood revealed the monster I'd recognized from the beginning, a creature carved from the same dark marble as my father, its features etched with the same cruel certainty of power absolute and unassailable. Principal Warner's call came exactly when I'd predicted, his voice carrying the strain of a man caught between moral imperative and professional survival. "The board's meeting this afternoon, Becky. Harris's lawyers are demanding your immediate suspension. They're claiming you've orchestrated a campaign of defamation." "Let them come," I replied, surprising him with the silk-wrapped steel in my voice. "Every accusation they make will only draw more attention to the story. And I've got something they don't yet realize exists." I ended the call and opened my laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard like a pianist preparing for their masterpiece. The second wave was already prepared, emails scheduled to reach every major news outlet in the state, containing footage from the hidden cameras I'd installed in my classroom, in the school parking lot, in the hallway outside the teacher's lounge. Every threat Harris had made, every moment of intimidation, captured and preserved with the patience of someone who'd learned long ago that survival sometimes requires becoming the predator instead of the prey. The sound of approaching footsteps drew my attention to the doorway. Jenny Martinez stood there, clutching a stack of documents to her chest like armor. "Those records you asked for from the county clerk's office," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ones about Harris's property holdings. There's something you need to see." The papers she laid on my desk were a revelation: property deeds, shell companies, a labyrinth of financial transactions that all led back to a single point, the abandoned psychiatric hospital on the edge of town. The same facility where Harris's wife spent 3 months last year during what the official story called a nervous breakdown. The hospital administrator, Jenny continued, her words carrying the weight of conspiracy finally unveiled, "He's on Harris's payroll. Has been for years. And there's more, medical records showing patterns of admissions, all women and children, all with similar injury profiles." The pieces clicked into place with terrible clarity. Harris hadn't just been using the hospital to control his wife, it was part of a larger operation, a place where inconvenient witnesses could disappear behind diagnoses of mental instability, their credibility eroded by carefully documented episodes of paranoid delusion. My hands shook as I pulled out my burner phone, sending a coded message to Mike's trusted partner on the force, Mason Memorial. "That's where the missing witnesses went." The response came almost immediately: "Federal task force is already mobilizing. Stay clear." But staying clear had never been my strategy. Not when I was 12 and documenting my father's abuse in a diary hidden beneath my mattress, not when I was 20 and testifying against him in court, and certainly not now. Harris had made a critical error in his assessment of me. He'd seen the schoolteacher, the nurturer, the caregiver, but failed to recognize the survivor beneath. He'd forgotten that those who've navigated the landscape of abuse learn to read its topography with perfect clarity. I gathered my documentation and headed for my car, mind already mapping out the next phase. The federal investigation would focus on the criminal enterprise, the human trafficking, the drug trade. But I had a different target in mind: the network of enablers, the respectable professionals who'd looked the other way, the pillars of community who'd chosen comfort over conscience. As I drove toward the school board meeting, my phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. A video attachment: Tommy, sitting in what appeared to be a hospital room, his eyes vacant and unfocused. Below it, words that were meant to break me: like mother, like son. Amazing what the right medications can do. The rage that filled me was arctic in its clarity, crystalline in its purpose. Harris thought he was playing his trump card, demonstrating his ultimate power over those he considered his possessions. Instead, He'd just handed me the key to his destruction. I pulled into the school parking lot, watching Harris's expensive lawyers file into the building with their briefcases full of threats and intimidation. They had no idea they were walking into an ambush orchestrated by someone who'd learned strategy from surviving a war they couldn't even imagine. Today would be the day they learned that sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't the one who bares their teeth, but the one who's spent a lifetime learning exactly where to sink them. Victory, when it came, tasted nothing like the sweet triumph I'd imagined in my darkest moments of planning. Instead, it carried the metallic tang of survival, sharp and bitter on the tongue like blood from a split lip. I stood in the federal courthouse, watching Harris being led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit now a costume stripped of power, his facade of respectability shattered beyond repair. The evidence I'd gathered had become an avalanche, burying not just Harris but the entire network of enablers who'd propped up his empire of pain. The school board meeting had been the perfect trap. Every attempt by his lawyers to discredit me only served to spotlight the very evidence they sought to suppress. Each threatening gesture, each attempt at intimidation, caught on cameras I'd positioned with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned young that documentation was sometimes the only shield against monsters who wore respectable masks. But it was the hospital records that proved to be his ultimate undoing. The federal task force found not just Tommy and his mother, but 17 other victims, women and children whose disappearances had been disguised as mental health commitments, their voices silenced by forced medications and falsified diagnoses. The administrator broke under questioning, revealing a pattern of corruption that stretched back decades. Mike's reinstatement to the force came with a formal apology and a promotion, the department scrambling to distance itself from the taint of Harris's influence. I watched my husband pin on his detective's badge with hands that no longer trembled, his eyes meeting mine across the room with an understanding deeper than words. We'd both been transformed by this battle, stripped down to our essential truths and rebuilt stronger. The day Tommy was released from the hospital, I waited in the corridor, my heart hammering against my ribs with a force that threatened to crack them. When he emerged, supported by his mother, now clear-eyed and free from the chemical chains Harris had used to control her, I saw in his face the same shadow war I'd fought in my own childhood. The same battle between fear and hope, between the instinct to hide and the desperate need to be seen. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, his voice stronger than I'd heard it in months. "You didn't give up." The words pierced me with their simple truth. I hadn't given up, couldn't give up, because somewhere in the depths of this fight, I'd realized I wasn't just battling for Tommy. I'd been waging war against every shadow that had ever made a child cower, every threat that had ever silenced a voice raised in protest, every system that protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Later that evening, as Mike and I sat in our garden watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of redemption, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what we'd accomplished. The newspaper lay on the table between us, its headline a validation of every risk taken: local teacher exposes criminal empire, Justice Department launches nationwide investigation. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Mike's voice carried the contemplative tone of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew. "That first night, when you told me about your plan. I was so afraid for you, but I never once doubted your strength. I just didn't understand the source of it until now." I traced the rim of my wine glass, watching the light fracture through the crystal. "Survival teaches you things that safety never can." Harris thought he was dealing with a simple schoolteacher. He never realized he was facing someone who'd learned warfare at the hands of experts in causing pain. "And now?" Mike asked, reaching across to take my hand. "What does the warrior do when the battle's won?" The question hung in the air like smoke, carrying the weight of all the transformations we'd undergone. I thought about my classroom, about the children who would sit in those desks tomorrow, each carrying their own invisible battles, their own need for someone to stand between them and the darkness. "Now," I said, my voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd finally found their true purpose, "we become guardians. We use what we've learned to protect others. Because there will always be more Harrises in the world, more systems that need dismantling, more voices that need amplifying. A text message lit up my phone, a photo from Tommy's mother. He was sitting at their kitchen table, homework spread out before him, a smile on his face that held no shadows. Beneath it, she'd written, "He's starting to dream again." Dreams. Such a simple word for such a profound concept. The ability to imagine a future unmarred by fear, to reach for tomorrow without checking over your shoulder. I'd given Tommy back his dreams, yes, but in doing so, I'd also reclaimed my own. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting our garden in shades of possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new opportunities to stand against the darkness. But now I understood, the greatest victory wasn't in destroying monsters, but in showing others they could be defeated. I squeezed Mike's hand, feeling the strength of our shared purpose flow between us. We'd emerged from this crucible not just survivors, but warriors with a cause. And somewhere in the gathering dusk, I felt my younger self, that terrified girl who'd once believed silence was her only safety, finally lay down her burdens and rest.